Baithak, brought to you by Rajasthan Patrika series, is called A Passage to America, and they have the stage.
Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to be here today with Vijay Seshadri. Vijay was actually born in Bangalore and moved to the USA at a very young age. He is the author of 3 collections of poetry, Wild Kingdom, The Long Meadow, and most recently, 3 sections. He's been recognized with a number of honors, most recently the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. His Pulitzer citation actually describes his work as a compelling collection of poems that examine human consciousness from both birth to dementia in a voice that is by turns witty, grave, compassionate, and remorseless. So maybe we could start on this rainy morning, which I think the sun's come out now. You moved to America as a young child, and you grew up in a sort of non-traditional, I think, immigrant kind of experience because you weren't in a sort of community of Indians, but you still very much identify with the immigrant experience. So I was wondering, how that came about.
Yeah, I think it would be, one has to be precise about one's historical experience because no one else is going to be, and everybody's going to kind of reduce you to larger narratives which are driven by their own experience. And, our experience of America, because we went there in the 1950s before the immigration laws had changed, and there were only small pockets of South Asians, basically in academic settings. This was the period of what was called the brain drain, before the larger migrations out of India of technical people starting in 1965 to America. And it wasn't one of immigration, but one of isolation, a kind of isolation that was absolute because it was a racial isolation, and it was a cultural isolation, and it sort of expanded into an immigrant experience as more South Asians started coming to America and communities started forming. But by the time that had happened, I'd already grown up and left the house. So what I remember about leaving Bangalore, coming first to Canada for 2 years and then to Ohio, was a radical isolation. And I think that shaped me in incalculable ways, interesting ways and, and difficult ways because isolation is always painful. And so, yeah, when I think about the subject of A Passage to America, I tend to think about something that's fairly fraught and dramatic. And I think it was for us. even though my parents were very modern people. You know, they were left-wing, they were progressive, they were sort of, you know, on the left of the spectrum of the Congress Party socialists of the independence period. And so they tended to think that they were leaving behind an old world for something that was new and that was forming, you know. That's a wonderful generation of Indians whose history hasn't been properly written, I think, and whose disappointment in what happened to the world hasn't been properly acknowledged or understood.
But I think one of the things that you also did take on was, I think, what America is about. It's a country of immigrants, and you were mentioning yesterday that you did take on sort of the American dream in some way. You was inspired, I think, as you were growing up.
Yeah. I would say not. I didn't necessarily take on the American dream. I took on the American tragedy. You know, because there's of course a great novel by Theodore Dreiser called An American Tragedy, and America has a tragic aspect to it, and that tragedy, when I was growing up, it's interesting to me that I've come to India and people are amazed that I spent 5 years working in the fishing industry on the northwest coast. There's a long piece of prose in my new book about that, and I try to explain to them that I grew up in the 60s in America, which was America's most energetic decade since the Civil War, and America's most tragic decade because of Vietnam, because of the Civil Rights Movement. The cities were burning, and America was engaged in this war where it's sort of, its moral position in the world became extremely problematic, especially to Americans, and especially to my generation of Americans. And so it was really the American tragedy, and what came out of that was the counterculture. So when I finally found a community that I could belong to, it was the American counterculture. It was sort of the America of, like, we're going to go on the road, we're going to embrace nature and reject society because society is hopelessly corrupt, and Vietnam is the example of that, and the widespread racism of the society is the example of that, is the manifestation of that, and so society has to be rejected. We were, a revolutionary generation, We subsequently, most of us, turned into yuppies and started making a lot of money, and
But maybe we could go back to that, sort of tell us a bit about the days when you were trying to explore the alternative and your time in this commercial fishing sector, and why you felt that was the way to sort of find yourself.
It wasn't, I always wanted to go to sea from the time I was a kid. And when I saw the Pacific Ocean, I was 20 years old, I'd graduated from college, and hitchhiked out to California. I saw the Pacific Ocean and said, oh, I have to get out on that, I have to, because the Pacific is tremendous. I'd seen the Atlantic, it hadn't impressed me at all. It's just a bump. I saw the Pacific and, it was just wow. And, but it wasn't necessarily, it was kind of an embrace of nature more than anything else. And nature is very powerful in America. Especially in the West, which is so spectacularly beautiful, and so dramatic, and so much still a wilderness, in which man has not made a mark. You can feel the presence and the power of nature. And, and that was the great discipline of a certain part of my generation of Americans who embraced the counterculture and who turned our backs on cities. When I graduated from college, nobody went back to New York. I went to college in the Midwest at a small liberal arts college, and the notion was you didn't go to New York because New York was falling apart. New York was bankrupt. The cities on the East Coast were bankrupt. And, you went out west. I mean, there's that famous injunction which goes back to the 19th century from Horace Greeley, right? Go west, young man, because the future is in the west. And that was still a part of the American experience then. The idea that the West was new and the East was old, and you left the old and you went to the new, And in that sense, it is kind of it dovetails in very nicely with the Indian experience of immigration to America, because, a lot of people leave India because of the new, W.H. Auden famously said that immigrants don't know what they want, but they know what they don't want. They really understand what they don't want. And I could see that in my father, definitely, that he wanted the West, he wanted science, he wanted the great institutions of basic research. He started out in physics and subsequently became a physical chemist. And he didn't want the old world. My mother very much wanted the old world, and she's always been nostalgic about, the Bangalore of her childhood and her youth, and always been bitter towards my father, I think.
So when you'd graduated from college and you were trying to decide whether to go into the more traditional, career path,
right.
Or whether explore your more creative or other side. And was that pressure kind of from your parents, or was it just a sign of the times and the other influences you were experiencing?
Yeah. It's a cliche which I don't think is accurate, that Indian American parents are always trying to turn their kids into doctors, right? And it's a way in which Indians tend to satirize themselves. Actually, I think they're a sophisticated parenting population, and South Asian children in America who grew up in America, whom I know, are, well taken care of and given a lot of options, but it's recognized that one is sort of in a minority position in a society, and you have to kind of have a cohesion to your experience. So, and if you want to have a cohesive experience, the best way to have a cohesive experience is to become a doctor, right? Because everybody needs to be healed. We're all sick and dying, in one way or shape or form, and that really makes sense. And it's not, it's not something that's invidious, I don't think. And I don't think there's a lot of, of course there's pressure because they, a striving immigrant population will always put pressure on its children to succeed, And of course, Indian Americans are remarkably successful. I don't know if this audience is, quite aware of, how extraordinary the achievements are there of the Indian American community. They have the highest per capita income of any group in America now, and I think something like 8% of doctors in America are of Indian origin alone, and then there are all of the other South Asian countries from which the medical community comes.
One thing that's interesting is when you did go on this boat in the sea,
right.
And you just said, talked about an immigrant knows what he doesn't want, but there's a beautiful moving prose in that piece where you actually explain how fulfilled you are, and the antithesis of that. So when the weather was good, or
right.
To be in the present like that is quite extraordinary, and to feel that kind of fulfillment.
Yeah. No,
And how did that experience then influence your later decisions in life?
Well, I don't know. I kind of make up a myth about myself, and I don't know if it's true or not, but I think anyone who is a writer starts sort of mythologizing their own experience in order to explain why they do this strange thing, which is write, especially do this very strange thing, which is write poetry. And my explanation to myself has always been that, well, I had two experiences, the American experience and the Indian experience, that were radically different. And the only way they could be integrated within myself was through the exercise of my imagination and through the act of making literature. And, the passage you're talking about, and there's a long prose section in my book, my recent book, 3 sections. It's called Pacific Fishes of Canada. And at the end of it, I talk about, on the one hand, and at the end of it, I'm on a Japanese fishing boat working as a biologist in the Bering Sea in the dead of winter. And when the weather is good, I feel elated, and when the weather is stormy, I feel, depressed and mortified at the position I find myself in. And those become the twin poles in that piece, I think, symbolically for me, of this kind of duality of the immigrant experience. And, and it's only language and it's only myth-making for me that can put those things together, I want to go on and say that I think it's true of everyone wherever they are, that they are divided, that the human self is divided. It just happens to be very clear to someone who's an immigrant, their divided nature.
But even though you did imbibe the sort of immigrant, I guess, being on the fringes and seeing society, but you also embraced, the American poetry tradition and found yourself very much part of it, and actually wrote the sort of quintessential American iconic poem, The Disappearances. Perhaps you could tell us something about that.
Yeah. I wrote, there was a poem I wrote that the New Yorker magazine put on its back page after 9/11. And I think, it was one of the strange miracles of America. America is a very difficult society. It's, it's a challenging society, but it's also, peculiarly open because it is so new and young.
And that poem was sort of described as basically speaking to generations of Americans and kind of, in a very poignant way, evoking a very sort of typical American experience.
Yeah. It was, it's a poem that I wrote right before 9/11 in that summer, and it was about, the poem goes through a series of images, and it rests at the end of it on the Kennedy assassination, which was the great public event of my childhood in America, the one that everyone in my generation remembered. And the New Yorker had bought the poem before 9/11, and when the attacks happened, it was apparent to everyone, and I think people had that thought that nothing like this had happened to America since the Kennedy assassination, that this was, an event of that order of magnitude. And those of us who remembered the assassination of John F. Kennedy remember the kind of hush that came over the country. And the poem, I wrote the poem because the mother of two of my playmates when I was a kid, had contracted cancer, and I was told this, and I remembered that the Saturday after President Kennedy was killed, we were, like kids, running around and playing in her house while she was watching the news on TV. And she said, "Hush, children, don't you understand? History is being made." And that sort of becomes the fulcrum of the poem, that quote of hers. And the New Yorker took it and put it on its back page, and that kind of became identified with 9/11 as sort of, the poem of that moment. Even though, of course, I would never have been able to write a poem in response to 9/11. And people came up to me afterwards and said, "Vijay, did you write that poem?" No, things like that are just so shocking that poetry, you can only respond in silence, I think.
And the poem sort of encapsulates sort of very typical American experience in life, and you know, I guess the thought being that it then changes completely.
Yeah.
And I think one article mentions a boy with the bees, you know,
Right, the ground wasp's nest.
Yes,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And it's mentioned as something very typical American.
Right.
And yet, that's an experience that you had from Bangalore.
Yeah.
Which is
exactly.
interesting.
Yeah. There are all sorts of images drawn because it's just, you know, when you hear that someone you knew in your childhood is about to die, of course, you know, when you're an adult, of course you start thinking about that period when you were a child, and images come up, and we remember our childhood as if it were a dream, you know. And so the poem is associative in this dreamlike way, and that's what it's about. It's about kind of recovering bits of memory, and it slowly resolves to this public event from these series of private events, and there's an expansiveness to it in that regard.
And I think that's echoed in a lot of your poetry. It's sort of your meticulous observance of detail, but at the same time the backdrop of actually asking the big questions and pushing the boundaries into a lot of, I guess, a sort of metaphysical domain
Sure.
there. And, you know, is that drawn on from sort of, I guess, your body of experience you've imbibed from perhaps India, or it's a more global sensibility, or just your own quest to find the meaning of life in yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I think, you know, aesthetic practice is complicated too, and, you know, I would say that the poetry is meant to be somewhat syllogistic in the sense that these incidents and details which have to be as specific and clear as possible, that have to be images, are arranged in such a way so that their final implication is much larger. That, you know, collectively, that there are no ideas that are interfering with the step-by-step development of the underlying argument. And so when the underlying argument is realized, it becomes bigger than it otherwise would have been. You know, that you get a series of images in that poem that culminates in the Kennedy assassination. And all of a sudden, and that's rendered imagistically too, but it's also a historical moment that the reader recognizes, and so that transforms the meaning of the subsequent images and gives them a quality to them, you know. So there's a definite relationship between, it's not a dialectic between the concrete and the abstract in poetry, but a way in which the concretization leads to the implied abstraction without ever actually expressing it. Does that make sense? Yeah.
And you use different tools also in your other poems as well. I mean, you consider yourself perhaps orthodox, but you use the sort of colloquial and vernacular with more orthodox style to sort of bring this out.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. Well, you know, a part of my love of America has to do with my love of the American language. I speak American, I write American, you know. George Bernard Shaw famously said that the English and the Americans are two people divided by a common language. Yeah, and I'm an American writer, you know. I always say, you know, because of course in America it's not as intense as it is in Europe, but there's always the issue of immigrants and whether immigrants belong, whether immigrants are American or not, whether, you know, where they fit in the society. And that's a global problem, and it's going to be an increasingly intense one, witness what is occurring in France right now, for example, and in Europe. But I've always said that, well, it's for you Americans, to decide whether I'm an American or not, but I've already established that I am an American poet, because I possess the language. And the issues of citizenship are not, the issues of citizenship are also linguistic. If you speak the language, are you a citizen of that language? Yeah, of course. So these things are very complicated, but they're fascinating.
And so how do you feel to be back in India, and what are your thoughts as an American, Indian?
Yeah. Oh, India's great. That's just, India's just fantastic. I mean, wow. Yeah. And appalling, and dreadful, but just amazing. Just
maybe. Oh, thank you so much. And
yeah.
maybe on that note of, we can perhaps
we can
have a few questions.
glad to
Yeah,
take
the
questions.
gentleman at the front.
Thank you so much, Vijay ji. The 60s was also being a decade of tragedy, a decade of hope.
Uh-huh.
In that context, there is some resonance of the contemporary American time and the 60s. So what is the challenge of hope today, and how poetry is embracing that? My quick other question is, you said that you were a practitioner of American English. Now, English language has some limitations, for example, in expressing the epic moment.
What?
Epic, the epic dimension of
Right,
human
sure.
life. So coming from India, have you been able to enrich some of the limitations of English, for example, a kind of border crossing between the Indic languages and the English language?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first is to hope. It's always the case that as much cause there is for hopelessness, there is just as much cause for hope, And I think it's a question of perception, and it's a question of your sort of psychological attitude. And there's this great kind of tradition in America. I was talking to my son about it yesterday, of the self-help book. The Americans invented the self-help book, and everybody else now has self-help books. And the first inventors were people like Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote The Power of Positive Thinking, and Dale Carnegie. I don't know if you know these names. How to Make Friends and Influence People. Is that the name of the book? And I think in terms of kind of being hopeful, you sort of have to exercise your will and say, well, I'm going to look at the possibilities. I mean, I was in despair about global warming recently, but then I thought, well, the technology is here, and it's very possible. I mean, for example, India has all of this coal to burn, and they need to burn coal because that's the fuel that they have, but there's no reason that that coal can't be burned in a way that produces zero emissions. I mean, I think the Chinese have actually started doing that. And so when you think about global warming, you think, oh my God, we're going to be inundated in water in 50 years, and Miami is going to disappear, and think of what's going to happen to, in Bengal. I mean, it's terrifying, right? But actually, we can reverse these things. So I think politically there's a lot of room for hope, and I think it's the job of literature to kind of see these things and develop them. As far as the language is concerned, I didn't quite understand that question, but the aspect of it that has to do with the epic sensibility, I can answer. I mean, I think I do sort of have a kind of epic sensibility in my poetry, and I think that comes from India. when I was very, very small, when my father was here getting his PhD, and my mother and I were living in my grandfather's house, and that house had an inner courtyard. I don't know if this is still done in India, but there used to be a brazier of coals on which coffee beans were roasted. And I remember the coffee bean roasting, and the coffee beans were bought green, and they were roasted in this round-bottom pan that was like a wok, And that brazier was left unattended one day when I was about 3 years old, and I was jumping back and forth over it, and I tripped, and the coals fell all over my legs, and I got these, third-degree burns, and I was put into my grandfather's bed, and he wasn't sleeping there anymore because my grandmother had died. He had shared the bed with her, and he wasn't sleeping in it anymore. And I was put into that bed, and they recited the Ramayana to me. They told me the whole story, and I can still remember such vivid episodes from it, from that time, And I always feel like, well, this is another myth that I make up about myself, that somehow, the epic imagination was infused into me then, that kind of sense of doing something extremely broad. And I've always had an impulse in my writing to kind of, take the lyric poem and make it epic somehow, make it big, expand it as much as possible.
I think we just have time for one more question. The lady
Okay.
with the black.
Vijay, I know you must have received congratulations from the Indian Americans in America. As one living there, I'd like to share with you that we're thrilled that an Indian, we always associated ourselves with technology and medicine, as you said. But when an Indian won the Pulitzer, we were absolutely thrilled. And many of us took to poetry after that. That feeling of isolation that you mentioned still exists. My question at the end of this is, I know you mentioned about not having the American dream, but having a feeling of isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Has the Pulitzer made you change that to the American? Did that become the American dream eventually for you, although it started as an American tragedy in your thought process?
Yeah, I like to think of myself as tragic. And I'm not going to give that up just because I won a prize. Just but it's a nice prize